of the show for today. We're talking to Dr. David Padgett from Tennessee State University, who's talking about the environmental justice movement that is concerned with some of the environmental injustices that are found throughout the nation as well as throughout the world. In a real sense, Dr. Padgett, let's continue our conversation, Dr. Padgett.
Yes, well, as I mentioned before, the environmental justice movement started when the environmental activists and civil rights activists came together during the 1970s, and it was pretty much a grassroots movement, but it started to gain some traction, and we started to get some amount of institutionalization beginning in the 1980s. And what I have here is a General Accounting Office report, which was the first environmental justice report, and it found that 3 out of 4 landfills in the South are found in low-income and African-American communities. Soon after, in 1987, came the Toxic Waste and Race in the United States study that was commissioned by, at the time, Reverend Dr. Benjamin F. Chavis, and that study found that it was race, not income, that was the most likely predictor for whether a person was going to live near a toxic waste site. During this time, Dr. Robert Bullard, as I mentioned before, who is known as the father of environmental justice, was working on a landfill siting in Houston, Texas. Actually, he was working for a group that was fighting against a landfill that was planned for an African-American community. As a result of his research, he wrote this book, Dumping in Dixie, which is probably one of the most well-known must-read books in terms of learning more about environmental justice. That book was published in 1990, so you started to see the academic community come together with the government a little bit, religious institutions, faith-based organizations coming together, and they came together in 1991 in Washington, D.C. They literally had a march on Washington in support of environmental justice, and they had a preamble and the whole thing. So that was a really bellwether event in 1991 when they marched on Washington. And since then, the movement has become much more sophisticated. Here locally, if we want to look at local issues, during the 1990s, when I moved to Nashville, there was a very well-known environmental injustice case here surrounding the Bordeaux landfill. The Bordeaux landfill was sited in Bordeaux. Bordeaux was one of the first places that African Americans of some means could move outside of the cities, following the 1968 Housing Rights Act to some degree. And then right along behind them came the Metro landfill, which used to take half of the city's waste. And now Bordeaux was a classic case because a lot of people will argue, well, people are next to these landfills and things because they're poor. But Bordeaux was not a low-income African American community. In fact, they had some of the most educated, maybe not wealthy, but certainly upper middle class African Americans in this community, and yet there they are next to a landfill. And it took years and years and years for that community to fight and finally shut that landfill down. But that was a classic environmental justice case here in Nashville, where community came together, rose up, and eventually shut that down. Of course, it doesn't completely eliminate the problem because now those wastes have to be shipped to somebody else's backyard. And so that's just an issue that is a part of all of our issues dealing with waste. Also here locally, currently we have an environmental injustice case that has made national headlines, and that is the Dixon, Tennessee case, which also resulted from landfill contamination. The landfill contaminants leaked into the local aquifer or groundwater out there in Dixon County. And according to the plaintiffs, in which is now a pretty well-known legal case, the lead plaintiffs being the Sheila Holt and her family, after, well, maybe a decade or so after the toxins were dumped into that landfill illegally, it was discovered that people's private wells in Dixon County and in and around Dixon were contaminated. Allegedly, the local government, county government, took whites off of their private wells and put them on the municipal water, which was safe, but allowed the African Americans, including Sheila Holt and her family, to continue to drink water contaminated with perchloroethylene, which is a toxic substance, causes liver and kidney damage and other health problems. Obviously, years after that, the Hope family and others discovered, oh, we've been drinking this contaminated water. It's well known that Sheila Holt herself is a cancer survivor. Her father, unfortunately, was not so lucky. He passed away also from cancer a couple of years ago. And so that case is a classic case of environmental injustice right here in Nashville. But these types of scenarios with waste being dumped in the backyards of African Americans have been played out all over the country. And in fact, just a couple of years ago, Dr. Bullard and a group of scientists updated the original 1987 toxin waste and race study in 2007 just to see, well, okay, we have new technology now, we have geographic information systems technology. Let's see if we apply a finer level of geography to this data today and see if we have anything different. And what they found out was nothing has really changed, that we can still predict the likelihood of people of color living next to or near or in close proximity to a hazardous waste site based upon race. It's not an income thing. And in fact, Dr. Benjamin Chavis himself in the early 1980s coined the term environmental racism, not to be confused with environmental justice or environmental injustice. Again, environmental justice is basically the movement to prevent the disproportionate negative impacts from environmental hazards upon people of color populations, whereas environmental racism clearly is about race. And environmental, Benjamin Chavis coined that term during a case in North Carolina, Warren County, where a community had a polychlorinated biphenyl dump placed in their backyard, and it was, out of all the places in North Carolina, they picked this mostly black community, and so that's when Chavis said, well, this is environmental racism. And so environmental racism is not just a domestic issue, but it's also a global issue.
In other words, when you look around the world, you find that the same situation is generally placed upon individuals who are of color.
Oh, yes.
In a real sense. And of course, we're going to take this commercial break, the second commercial break, and we'll get back and continue our conversation. And we'll be back with this audience following this very, very short commercial break.